Hi, in this video I want to talk to you about how to use something I call cultural tension spectrums to interpret a cultural theme in American literature. In other words, how can we talk about the relationship between a text and the cultural context in American history of that text? Now, our syllabus explains to us why we need to do this. We've got a outcome, number 3, that's totally about the relationship between text and culture, and we've got an objective that explores a similar idea. What we need, and what I'm hoping we'll develop in this video, is a tool, an intellectual approach to developing these important skills in the course. So that brings us to the how. How can we connect cultural themes and American literary texts? Well, the first thing we want to do is identify the kind of broad themes that run in American culture. We're going to focus here on 3 of them: race, nature, and ethics. But if you check page 2 of the syllabus, you'll see I've got a list there of at least 10 of them, and we'll probably identify others through our conversation this semester. Once we've identified these broad cultural themes, though, we need a tool that helps us do more than describe them. We need a tool that will help us have something more challenging, interesting, more in need of justification and explanation than just broad themes and a description of their existence in texts. And this is where being able to look at cultural tensions, or better said, spectrums of cultural tensions, specific ideas related to the cultural theme that were being negotiated or argued or processed through moments of exchange, to use Greenblattian language, in the culture. So let's take a look at what the relationship between these themes and tensions is and how it might work. And we can do that by starting with race. When we talk about race in American culture, there's often 2 major ideas that are being contested. On the one hand, there's a long history of racial hierarchy, usually formulated as a variation on white supremacy, right? The superiority of white and or European culture over indigenous cultures, what we now call Black or African American cultures, cultures from other immigrant groups. On the other side, though, just as significantly, more significantly in the last 50 years, let us say, since the Civil Rights Act of 65, so that's 60 years now, is the ideal of cultural equality. And in the period that we're studying, the ideal of cultural equality begins as a rather faint voice, but then becomes stronger and stronger until it becomes one of the primary forces in the Civil War era. What I just said, I think, points to the second thing we really want to keep in our mind when we talk about these cultural tensions, which is they're not either ors. A text very rarely entirely emphasizes racial hierarchy or entirely emphasizes racial equality. Sometimes it does. Sometimes a writer is really hitching her or himself to one or the other of those ideas. But often, what's being reflected in a literary text is some subtle mix of those 2 ideas. And discovering that mix and figuring out how a text is commenting on it, what a text has to say about it, is the fundamental interpretive move we're going to make in this course. It's that move of applying attention to a theme and applying that tension and that theme to a text is going to be what frames our guiding questions as we write thesis statements and claims in this class. Let's look at another major theme that is going to appear throughout the semester, and particularly in these early pieces that we're reading, which is our relationship with nature. Americans have, since the earliest writings that we can encounter, right from the Native American text that we read last week to the exploration or conquest invasion text we're going to read this week, we've always had mixed feelings about nature. On one end of the spectrum is the idea that nature is a commodity, something that we consume to either survive, which was more the quest of the Native American cultures, or economically advance, which was more the goal of the European cultures we're going to look at. So we've got this tension. On the one side, Americans see nature as a commodity, something to use and consume. But on the other hand, nature has always been, for both Europeans and Native Americans, a spiritual presence, a transcendent space, something beautiful and awesome, an insight into the divine. And these traditions certainly continue all the way to today, where Americans are still negotiating these split feelings between nature as commodity and nature as a divine or transcendent space. Again, remember, though, that rarely is it an either or. There's a tendency, for example, to talk about Native American cultures as celebrating the human spiritual relationship and harmony with nature. And that's certainly true. But Native Americans also struggled to use nature as a commodity to survive. And many of the conflicts between tribes were conflicts over natural resources. And natural resources shaped how these communities were structured, even their population and reproduction patterns. So to see a cultural group or a text from a cultural group or commenting on a cultural group as being purely one or the other of these would be unusual, although not entirely impossible, just unusual. Instead of an either or, we're usually exploring a spectrum. We're usually exploring a mix of these ideas. Let's look at one more before we move on to our early exploration texts. Ethics. When we talk about ethics, we're talking about the constant human struggle to live what we perceive as the good life, the right life, the proper life. And this can be framed in religious terms, but it can also be framed in secular terms. And one of the biggest cultural tensions we encounter right from the get-go in American literary and cultural texts is between what Europeans are going to call their Christian idealism, their Christian faith, and the behaviors that faith calls them to, right? A belief in God, but also a Christ-like treatment of other people. So for Columbus and Cabeza de Vaca and Champlain, they should, if they're acting as Christians, see Native Americans as fellow creatures of God. They should be interested in converting those Native Americans, but they also should be interested in treating them well, right? And following the golden rules of the Old and New Testament. Instead, though, they often veer from that path and engage in violence and exploitation and appropriation of natural resources and cultural resources because they're also driven by material or economic desire, which is clearly a secular impulse, right? The desire to have more stuff, the desire to expand your economy, the desire to improve the material quality of life of the individual or a group of people. And again, we're going to see in American cultural history these two modes of understanding how we should live our lives competing with each other, pushing and pulling at each other. And again, it's easy to see Christian idealism meaning good and material economic desire meaning bad. But let's face it, the need to respond to poverty, the need to provide physical and material comfort is something that is also part of an ethical life. It turns into abuse and greed and appropriation when it becomes the impulse to have more, right? More than is necessary. The impulse for spectacular wealth. And we hear it and we see it in these texts, right? The motive of greed. But don't confuse material and economic desire with simply greed. In and of itself, material and economic desire can be a healthy impulse for a culture, right? A culture has to survive. People have to live. People have to eat. People above to be secure. It's just that in certain economic models, like the imperialism that drove European cultures that were arriving in the Americas, in imperialistic models, the desire for material and economic resources can become abusive, right? And can become a justification for appropriation. Okay, so we've taken a look at what I'm hoping are some useful tools for interpreting culture and literature by looking through the lens of cultural tension spectrums. Look for these themes and tensions as you read our texts for this week. Use your annotations to focus on these ideas. For example, use the theme codes that I provided on page 2 of your syllabus page 3 of your syllabus as margin notes. Those little 1 or 2 letter theme codes can identify passages that are related to those themes. Later, when you want to write about the text, you can flip through your text and just look for those little margin tags you've created. That will point you towards texts that you've underlined that are related to the themes of the course. In this case, we're starting with nature and ethics and race, and you'll have those resources right there for you when you want to contribute to a discussion forum or write a paper. Be prepared to apply these cultural tensions and themes in our discussions and in our activities inside Blackboard, like quizzes and discussion forums or wikis or journals. But also understand that this idea of cultural tension is going to be the driving force in the interpretations we make in our papers in American literature. And I want you from the get-go to be thinking about these ideas as you read texts. Okay, thanks a lot. See you in Blackboard.